I didn't even have time to really inhale the aroma of freshly baked apple pie, as my heart instantly tightened, and an icy chill seemed to spread in my chest. My parents and sister Jessica were sitting in the living room, completely at ease on an old but cozy sofa. Their presence in this house, in this place that had become my home, seemed somehow alien, almost absurd, and for a second it even seemed to me that I had entered the wrong door and gone to the wrong place. Mom, elegant as always, in an immaculately ironed ivory blouse, sat looking as if 8 years had not passed, as if we had parted yesterday and we had no hard feelings, no unresolved issues. My father, who had aged, with slightly thinning hair and wrinkles on his forehead that I hadn't noticed before, was holding a cup of coffee in his hands, but his fingers were squeezing it a little harder than they should have been, betraying inner tension. And Jessica. She hadn't changed much. She still had the same attentive, slightly appraising look, and a slight smile that might have seemed friendly if I hadn't known her better. I froze in the doorway, clutching the pie dish tighter in my hands, trying to hold back the trembling that gripped my fingers. The moment hung in the air, taut, sticky, like superheated caramel syrup. "Michelle, dear," Aunt Sarah's voice, soft and enveloping like a cozy wool blanket, broke this oppressive silence. "I'm so glad you came. Come on, have a seat." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my breathing, and finally forced myself to move forward, went into the kitchen, put the pie on the table, and automatically adjusted the edges of the foil, as if it were the most important thing in the world right now. "You look great," Jessica said suddenly, and her voice sounded almost sincere. "It's been so long since we've seen each other." I slowly raised my eyes and met her gaze, trying to figure out what was hidden behind those words, just politeness or something more. "Yes, a long time ago," I said, trying to keep my voice level, but the feeling like I was standing in a minefield wouldn't leave me. "Would you like some tea?" Aunt Sarah suggested, and I instantly seized this saving opportunity to distract myself, nodded and sat down at the table, trying not to look in the direction of my parents. Mom set down her cup, leaned forward slightly, and finally spoke. "Michelle," her voice was the same as the day she told me that the money for my tuition would go to Jessica's wedding. We're glad to see you." I felt something tighten painfully inside, and immediately a wave of indignation rose. How easy, how simple. "We're glad to see you." So, after 8 years of silence, after I was just a shadow to them, a ghost of the past that was not remembered? Really? A bitter smile escaped my lips. "Are you glad to see me?" Mom was embarrassed, her fingers nervously slid along the edge of the tablecloth, and my father sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We know that a lot has been said and done," he said carefully. "Yeah, a lot." I abruptly pushed the cup away, so that the spoon in it rattled. "You have no idea how much." There was an awkward pause. The room was filled with the smell of cinnamon, apples, and freshly baked bread, and the silence was as thick as cream sauce. "Look, let's just start over," Jessica asked, but I just shook my head, barely able to contain a bitter laugh. "Shall we start over?" I looked straight into her eyes. Is it possible to start over something that has never started? For 2 weeks, I lived as if suspended between the past, which suddenly overtook me again, and the present, in which I was accustomed to complete independence and the absence of them in my life. I went to work, made deals, met with clients, discussed investment strategies with colleagues, but whenever I had a free minute, when I found myself alone in the silence of my apartment, my thoughts returned to that conversation that took place on the porch of Aunt Sarah's house. I heard my mother's voice again, felt her closeness, saw her eyes fill with tears, noticed the trembling in her hands. I remembered my father, his guilty look, his awkward attempts to find the right words. I saw Jessica, who, oddly enough, did not look as self-confident as usual, but rather confused, as if she herself did not fully understand how we could now exist in the same reality. I tried to put all these thoughts aside, but they kept coming back. I picked up my phone to distract myself, but as I scrolled through social media or checked my email, I found myself looking for them over and over again. Had they texted me? Maybe Mom found the strength and still sent me a letter that she hadn't dared to write for 8 years? But no, the phone remained silent as before. They gave me the time they promised, but it didn't make it any easier. One evening, when I was about to go to bed, my gaze accidentally fell on an old box standing in the corner of the closet. I didn't open it for many years, just transported it from apartment to apartment, not even remembering what exactly was stored in it. I took it out, blew off a thin layer of dust, and carefully opened the lid. Inside, neatly folded, were letters, photographs, old school notebooks, and beneath them, the very piece of paper that once turned my life around, a college enrollment letter. I remembered how my hands were shaking, how fast my heart was beating when I read every word, realizing that my hard work, my sleepless nights, my efforts had finally led me to a dream. I remembered how excited I was to run home to tell my parents. I saw so clearly the moment when I entered the house, expecting joy, pride, hugs. But all she got was her mother's cold, indifferent voice saying those very words, "We can't pay for your college." I clenched my fingers on the edge of the paper, feeling the anger rise in me again, but this time it wasn't as fierce as before. More like, tired. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Yes, they betrayed me then. Yes, they chose another daughter, her future, her happiness, not mine. But I survived. I did it. I found a way, even when I was told that I had to come up with something on my own. I slowly put the letter back in the box and closed it. The next day, I couldn't resist texting Aunt Sarah before I went to work. "How are they?" was a short, simple message, but as I sent it, I felt something inside me tremble. The answer came quickly, "They're fine. They're thinking about you." I stared at the phone screen for a long time before replying, "Say hi to them." It was a small step. Insignificant. But maybe the first one. "Oh, Michelle, you still remember what I like," she smiled, gently running her fingers over the box with the new coffee maker that I chose for her, knowing how much she loves the morning ritual of freshly brewed coffee. "You really have no idea how useful this is. My old one is already completely mad. She either makes coffee that looks like dirty water or spits boiling water." I laughed as I watched her look at the gift with genuine pleasure, as if it were not an ordinary household appliance, but something truly precious. I remembered all these details of her life, her habits, her little joys, the way she wrinkled her forehead when she read the newspaper, how she took my hand if we walked through the market, how she imperceptibly put some homemade pies in my bag, even when I assured her that I didn't need anything. "You could just say you want a new coffee maker," I teased, grabbing a cup from her old wooden table. "Yes, but then it wouldn't be a surprise," she winked. The room smelled of vanilla and cinnamon. Her signature buns, which I remembered from childhood, were baked in the oven. We were sitting in the kitchen, just like when I used to come here as a teenager after quarrels with my parents, when I told her about my dreams, my plans, and how I see my future. "And how does it feel to be part of the family again?" "What is it?" she asked, looking at me over the rim of her cup. I thought about it. "It's weird," I admitted. "I can't say that everything has become the same as before, but, probably, it shouldn't be the same as before. Jessica. She's changed. She's trying. We go to lunch together, talk, and remember our childhood. I still don't know what I expect from Mom and Dad, but did you give them a chance?" I nodded. "Yes. And, it seems, for the first time, I feel that they really want to fix something, and not just take the blame off themselves." Aunt Sarah looked at me intently, her eyes shining with warmth and something else, something like pride. "It's not easy, you know," she said softly. "Being strong is one thing, but being able to give a second opportunity to those who once offended you is something else entirely." I was silent, warming my palms on the cup. "And you?" I asked, changing the subject. Are you coming to stay with us for Christmas? She smiled, but there was a slight shadow in her eyes. You know I don't really like noisy gatherings, she said, bending down to check on the buns in the oven. But this isn't just a meeting, Aunt Sarah. It's a family. She looked at me for a moment, and then nodded, sighing softly. Good. But only if you let me choose a gift for you. Only if it's not another wool shawl, I laughed. She just smiled slyly, and at that moment I realized that in a way she had always been the family I was looking for. When I returned home, the apartment was quiet, but my soul was surprisingly calm. I looked at my phone and there was a new message from Jessica on the screen. Come back tomorrow, Mom wants to cook your favorite dessert. I didn't delay answering. Good. See you tomorrow. The silence in the room was too thick, too heavy, as if someone had let out all the air in an instant, leaving us gasping in uncertainty. I watched as Mom looked at her plate, her lips pressed into a thin, tense line, as Dad nervously rubbed the edge of the cup with his fingers, as if trying to hold not only the porcelain in his hands, but also the situation itself, which seemed to threaten to fall apart like a house of cards. Jessica gently squeezed Mom's hand, but she didn't say anything, and I realized that it wasn't a surprise to them. They had already discussed it among themselves, had already experienced the first shock, and now they finally decided to tell me about it. How much time do you have? I asked, trying to make my voice sound calm and confident, without a shadow of the anxiety that was already rising inside me. Until the end of the month, Mom looked up, and there was something in them that I didn't like, a timid hope mixed with fear. They offered a small severance package, but it's not even enough to cover one of the medical bills. I nodded silently, automatically picking up a piece of apple pie with my spoon, but I still didn't taste it. A year ago, I wouldn't even have thought about intervening, but now, after all these months, after a trip to the ocean, after Sunday dinners became something I took for granted, I couldn't just get up from the table and leave, pretending that it wasn't me. Concerns. I'll help, I said, and despite my inner tension, my voice was firm. No, honey, Mom immediately shook her head, although relief flashed in her eyes. You've already done so much for us. I said I'd help, I repeated, setting down my spoon, and that's out of the question. I saw Dad nod curtly, as Jessica relaxed a little, and Mom closed her eyes for a second, and it became clear to me that no matter how proud she was, deep down she understood that they couldn't cope without help right now. In the following days, I looked at all the possible jobs I could find for her, studied the job market, consulted with people I knew in the field of education, and sent several recommendations on my behalf. But the situation turned out to be more complicated than I expected. Age, health problems, lack of necessary skills did not play in her favor. Maybe something temporary? I asked cautiously, when we were once again discussing possible options over a cup of tea. I tried, Mom sighed wearily. But do you know how it is now? I really knew. The job market was ruthless, especially for those over 50. I didn't want to put pressure on her, I didn't want to make her feel obligated, but every day I realized that the solution was asking for itself. After all, this is my family. I have an idea, I finally said, putting the cup down on the table. You could work at our office. Mom looked at me in amazement. Where? In an investment company? There was disbelief in her voice. We have administrative vacancies, I explained. It's not a library, of course, but the work is stable, with good conditions and insurance. And most importantly, it's an opportunity. She hesitated, and I could see emotions fighting in her, pride, fear, gratitude. But, are you sure? Absolutely, I replied firmly. I'll talk to the management. All you need to do is get an interview, and we'll handle the rest. She took a deep breath and finally nodded. Good. For the first time in many years, I felt like I wasn't just lending a helping hand, but really making a difference in their lives, and the strangest thing was, It felt right. They were talking about your family, Aunt Sarah continued, her voice strained, almost apologetic, as if she didn't want to tell me this herself, but she knew she had to. I didn't want to interfere, but I think you need to hear this. I felt something uncomfortably constrict inside. I nodded silently, encouraging her to continue, even though a part of me was already preparing for the worst. They were talking about money, Michelle, she sighed, looking at me over the rim of her cup. That your parents brag about how you help them. How do you pay bills, give money for repairs, pay for trips? I sat up abruptly, feeling a wave of hot irritation sweep through my body. Bragging? I asked, and my voice sounded sharper than I had intended. I don't think they did it intentionally, but you know how people like to talk. Linda said that your mom recently discussed with someone that you, in fact, are now the main financial support of the family, and that it would be very difficult for them without you. I steepled my fingers, trying to process what I'd just heard. I've never regretted helping. It was my decision, a conscious step that I took because I wanted to, not because someone forced me to do it. But it's one thing to help, and another is to become a topic of discussion among the neighbors from the book club. That's not all, Aunt Sarah continued, hesitating. I felt an unpleasant twirl in my stomach. Tell me. They were discussing that Jessica was going to get married again, she said carefully, studying my face. I blinked, feeling my annoyance turn to confusion. What? I don't know all the details, but it seems that she has been dating someone for several months, and if you believe the rumors, they are already planning a wedding. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange, unpleasant feeling rise in me. Jessica and I have become really close over the last year. We spent time together, talked about life, shared experiences. But not once, did she mention that she had someone. Are you sure? As sure as you can be when it comes to book club conversations, Aunt Sarah shrugged. But it seems strange to me that you didn't know anything. I was silent, trying to sort out my feelings. It was like a light punch in the gut, not fatal, but painful. Why didn't she say anything? Why do I find out about this through third parties? Thanks for telling me, I finally said, trying to pull myself together. Will you talk to her? I don't know yet, I admitted. On the way back home, I couldn't stop thinking. Two questions were running through my head. Why was Jessica hiding this from me? And do my parents really perceive me not as a daughter, but as a convenient source of income? When I returned to the apartment, the phone was already vibrating from an incoming call. Jessica. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed the answer button. Hi, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Hello. Her voice was as light and carefree as ever. How are you? Not bad, I replied, leaning against the windowsill. I've heard something interesting. There was a tense pause on the other end of the line. Yes? So what? That you're going to get married, I said, bluntly, without bluntness. The silence stretched for a few seconds, followed by a short sigh. Who told you? It doesn't matter. Are you really going to get married? Yes, she finally admitted. But I was going to tell you, honestly. I just didn't know how. You didn't know how? I asked, feeling my irritation rise with renewed force. After everything we've been through? After I became a part of your life again? You didn't know how to tell me you were going to get married? It's not that easy, Michelle, she said, sounding less confident. What's so difficult about that? You just say, Michelle, I've got a man, I love him, and we're planning a wedding. Is it really that hard? I was afraid of how you'd react, she confessed softly. Why? Because, she hesitated. Because he wants us to leave. I felt my stomach turn cold. Gone? Where to? To California, she said. He has a job there, a nice house. He wants me and the kids to move in with him. I gripped the edge of the windowsill, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. And you agreed? I think so. I closed my eyes, feeling something inside me tighten painfully. When were you going to tell me about this? I do not know. Her voice trembled. Michelle, I don't want to lose you, but this is my chance for a new life. I was silent, trying to process what I had heard. Don't you think that's unfair? I finally said. What's unfair? That I've just learned to trust you again, and now you're just going to leave. She sighed heavily. I don't want you to think I'm leaving you. How else should I take it? Jessica stopped talking. I don't expect you to understand everything right away, she said softly. But please, just think about it. I nodded, even though I knew she wouldn't see it. Okay, I breathed. I need some time. I understand. When the call ended, I sat in the dark for a long time, looking at the lights of the night city, feeling something break inside me. I had just found a family, and now I was in danger of losing it again. The silence that followed my words was so thick that it seemed as if the air in the house had become viscous, as if the walls had moved closer, as if trying to lock me in this moment, in this icy, cool truth, which I now saw in all its naked essence. Mom was standing in the doorway, her fingers still gripping the doorknob, but now not with concern, but with a kind of sharp, numb irritation, as if she already regretted opening the door to me at all. Dad frowned, but said nothing, just looked at Jessica, waiting for her reaction. Jessica. There was something like confusion in her eyes, maybe even a slight sense of guilt, but it was so subtle that I couldn't be sure if she really realized how wrong it all was, or if she just hadn't had time to figure out how best to get out. But you had savings, she finally said, her voice level but lacking the warm concern she'd shown me before. They were, I nodded, tightening my grip on the suitcase handle, but they quickly go away when you don't have anything to cover rent, medical insurance, and bills. Mom ran her hands through her hair nervously, as if trying to cope with the storm of thoughts that raced through her head. It's terrible, honey, of course you can stay, she said, but her voice sounded strained, without the maternal gentleness that I had longed for. I nodded, letting her believe that I was taking her words at face value. Thanks, Mom. I really appreciate it. I entered the house, feeling something burning inside me, something cold, something that made my hands clench into fists, but I kept a carefully rehearsed expression of helplessness and gratitude on my face. I put my suitcases in the corner of the hallway, took a cursory glance at the living room, the same furniture as 8 years ago, but now it seemed to me that I was looking at it for the first time, without that veil of longing and nostalgia that had previously clouded my eyes. Dinner will be ready in an hour, Mom said, but her voice was empty, devoid of sincere hospitality. Great, I replied, and there was nothing real in my smile. I spent the evening watching Mom and Dad exchange glances, as Jessica pursed her lips, as tension slowly but surely filled every corner of this house. They wanted to ask a question, but they were afraid to say it out loud. Where can I get the money now? The next day, Mom started a conversation over breakfast. And, have you applied for a resume somewhere? What is it? She asked, pretending to be interested in my professional fate. I put down my fork and sighed, feigning tiredness. Yes, but the market is difficult now, the competition is high, and with such a reputation as I have now, I shook my head ruefully. I was told that at best I would be able to count on a job with hourly pay. Dad frowned, Mom frowned, Jessica looked away. It means, my mother began, but stopped. That I won't be able to help you anytime soon, I finished for her, looking straight into her eyes. They lowered their gazes. Was there disappointment in their faces? Definitely. Was there concern in their faces? No. I lived in this house for exactly 4 days. For days filled with silence, tension, and understatement. For 4 days, during which they tried their best to maintain a mask of compassion, but every day it became more difficult. They didn't know what to do with me if I couldn't benefit them. And on the 5th day, my mom knocked on my door. "Michelle, we've been talking." Her voice was strained. "Yes?" I looked up at her. "We thought that maybe you should try to find a cheaper place to live. You know, so you can get back on your feet faster." She looked at me with that tight, fake smile that instantly destroyed the last remnants of illusions in my soul. I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said, not allowing any emotion to break through. "I need to move on." The next day, I packed my things. They didn't even ask where I was going. I left the house, got into the car, and exhaled deeply. Then she took out her phone, opened the banking application, and transferred the money back to her account. All year long, I've been paying them for the opportunity to feel needed. That's enough now. I turned on the ignition and drove to where they were really waiting for me. To Aunt Sarah. I've never felt so free. For the first time in many years, I didn't have chains pulling me back invisibly, no guilt towards my family, no imposed duty, no fear that someone would not be able to cope without my help. There was only this space, flooded with warm light, smelling of fresh paint and new furniture, full of possibilities and promise. Aunt Sarah, with her sleeves rolled up, was vigorously raking through the cardboard boxes that we had piled in the corner of the living room. "And where will we have a coffee maker?" "What is it?" she asked, wiping her forehead and giving me a sly look. I grinned, leaning against the kitchen island and looking at the cozy space that now belonged to me. "In the most visible place," I replied, "right here, next to the window, so that you can drink coffee and admire the view every morning." She nodded approvingly. "That's what I understand, priorities." We spent the whole evening putting books on shelves, hanging paintings, and assembling furniture. Every element that appeared in the apartment made it look more and more like my home, and not just a place where I would return after a long day at work. I slept peacefully for the first time in many months. The next week was a whirlwind of business, paperwork for an apartment, finishing touches on the furniture, meeting with friends whom I had been putting off for a long time due to endless family matters. I felt light, almost carefree, as if I'd lifted a heavy weight off my shoulders that I'd been carrying for too long. And only one moment marred my newfound peace. "Jessica." I waited for her to write. "He'll call. He'll try to explain himself." I couldn't believe that she was really ready to give up on me so easily, so ruthlessly, without a shadow of regret. But as the days passed, her number did not appear in the inbox. I wasn't going to write to her first. But as it turned out, I didn't have to. They appeared suddenly, in the middle of my workday, when I had just returned from an important meeting. The assistant looked confused when she looked into my office. "I'm sorry, Michelle, but you have, visitors here. They said it was off the record, but they say it's important." It took me a moment to figure out who she was talking about. "Who's that?" She clutched the tablet uncertainly in her hands. "Jessica and your parents." I slowly looked up from my laptop screen. "Are you kidding?" "I'm afraid not," she smiled apologetically. For a second, I wanted to tell her to unfold them, but something inside me, some curiosity or maybe gloating, made me change my mind. "Okay," I nodded, steepling my fingers. "Let them come in." The door opened, and they came into the office, the same people who, just a couple of weeks ago, kicked me out of the house as an unnecessary thing. Mom was dressed with her usual neatness, but she looked tense, and Dad kept his usual important silence, but his lips were pressed into a thin line. Jessica. Jessica didn't look like her usual self. There was no confidence in her eyes from before. They stopped a few steps away from my desk, as if they didn't know where to start. "You're not answering your phone," Jessica finally said, and I heard a note of reproach in her voice. I raised my eyebrows. Do we really have anything to talk about? She gritted her teeth. We need to explain ourselves. Really? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. And when exactly did you realize that you had something to explain? When did you throw my suitcases on the porch? Or when you realized that I was no longer paying for your bills? Mom nervously tugged at her sleeve. Michelle, we didn't want this to happen. I chuckled. No, that's exactly what you wanted. You just didn't expect that I wouldn't come back, begging you to forgive me. You don't understand, Jessica began, but I held up my hand, stopping her. No, you don't understand. All of you. A year ago, I thought I had a family again. I have invested everything I could in you, money, time, emotions. I turned a blind eye to the little things, to the things that now seem so obvious to me. I was kidding myself because I wanted to believe that we could start with a clean slate. I stood up from the table, looking straight into their faces. But it seems that you didn't need a family. You needed a sponsor. It's not fair, Jessica blurted out. Really? I narrowed my eyes. Then answer me a question. If I really lost my job, if I really couldn't support you anymore, would you be standing here right now trying to rebuild a relationship? She opened her mouth, but couldn't find anything to say. That's what I thought, I nodded. Mom tried to smile, but her smile was shaking. Michelle, we are a family after all. Family? I laughed, and it sounded cold even to me. A family that throws me out on the street at the first difficulty? They fell silent again. I'm sorry about what happened, I finally said, but I'm not going to play this game anymore. I looked at them for the last time, and at that moment I felt an amazing, slight relief. You can go now. They didn't argue. Jessica turned away first and headed for the exit. Her parents followed her. I didn't look after them. When the door closed behind them, I returned to my desk, picked up my phone, and opened my contact list. She stared at the 3 names for a couple of seconds, and then, without hesitation, deleted them. Then, as if nothing had happened, she continued to work. I had a new life ahead of me. The night Aunt Sarah left, I sat on the balcony for a long time, letting the fresh night air dispel the last remnants of tension, which was still faintly vibrating somewhere deep inside, like an echo of the past year. The city was roaring below, the headlights were breaking on the glass facades. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the muffled sound of music, but inside me there was silence, not empty, but the silence of fullness, when everything finally falls into place. I no longer waited for calls, did not check my phone, did not find myself cringing internally at every unknown number. My parents and Jessica tried several more times to break through the wall I had erected, but none of their methods worked. They wrote messages with different intonations, from pitying to accusatory. They tried to surprise me at the office by showing up there again, but the guards knew the instructions, and I didn't even have to go out to them. One day they sent me a letter, real, paper, but without even opening it, I threw it into the shredder, watching as the pages with their words slowly turned into smooth strips of paper, useless and as empty as their apologies. I chose myself. A few weeks later, I bought tickets to Europe. I had arranged this vacation for myself, and now no one could tell me how and with whom I should spend it. Paris was humid and cool at this time of the year, but I enjoyed every moment of it, the way the morning mist crept across the pavement, as croissants were baked in small bakeries, filling the streets with the warm smell of butter and coffee, as the river reflected the thousands of twinkling lights of the night city. I walked through the narrow streets, absorbing the rhythm of the place I had dreamed of for so long, went into small shops, unhurriedly choosing souvenirs, sat in street cafes, listening to unfamiliar conversations, noticing the gestures of people I would never meet again, but who for a second became part of my world. It was all just for me. One morning, when I was sitting in a cafe by the Seine, Slowly sipping a cappuccino, my phone vibrated on the table. I looked at the screen. Jessica. One missed call. Then another one. And then the message, I'm getting married. You're still my sister, even if you're angry. I hope you'll come. I stared at the text, feeling something warm and strange rising inside, but then, without the slightest regret, I deleted the message. I was no longer her sister. Maybe once upon a time, when we were children, when we built sand castles in the backyard, when we whispered at night under the covers, when we shared childhood fears and dreams, but the girl I was then grew up, and the sister who was next to me disappeared. I took a sip of my coffee, smiling to myself. Life went on. 6 months later, I was sitting on my balcony again, exposing my face to the soft spring breeze, letting the warm rays of the evening sun warm my skin. I'm thinking of moving to the city, Aunt Sarah said, sipping her wine. I raised my eyebrows. Really? Yes. She looked at me with a smile. After all, I have someone very important here. I felt a warmth spreading in my chest. That's great, I said, holding out my glass to her. We clinked glasses, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon. Life went on, and now it belonged only to me.